Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Great Barton Cane Experiment, Shapes. If you'd like to view the Great Barton Cane Experiment part 1 cane types, you can see the link in the description of this video. Thank you so much to Barton Cane. I can't go any further in this video without saying that. They have been so wonderful in sponsoring both of these videos to show off their cane types as well as all of their shapes. I am experimenting with 13 different shapes in this video, 3 reeds each, which is a huge investment in cane, so I'm really excited to be representing Barton Cane here in this video. You might be wondering, why make these videos? Well, I'll explain. I've experimented with shapes before in my undergrad, in my master's, and my doctorate, but I've never experimented with such a large span of shapes before all at one time. To put some perspective on the pricing of cane and shapes in general, there are two types of shapers. We've got fold-over shapers and flat shapers. Each flat shaper is about $150, and then each fold-over shaper, which is made by Rieger, the fold-over shaper handle itself is about $200, and then each tip that you buy for that handle is about $150. So 13 different shapes for $150 each is a lot of money. So being able to turn to Barton Cane for all of these different shapes and all of these different cane types is huge to save money. So if you're ever experimenting and you want to try different shapes and different cane types, depending on the kind of experiment you want to run, you might turn to somewhere like Barton Cane or a double reed specialist who sells specific different types of GSP cane, gouge-shaped and profiled cane. I would recommend whenever you experiment, make sure you buy 3 to 5 pieces of cane in whatever type that you're trying to experiment with. If you're experimenting with the gouge, the profile, the shape, the scrape, anything that you're doing, try and get 3 to 5 reeds made in that style of whatever you're doing to make sure that you have a good representation of whatever you're trying to change. Don't be afraid when you're experimenting to dislike certain reeds and discard them as bad representations of whatever you're experimenting with. If all of your examples feel like that, perhaps it's a sign that whatever you changed isn't working for you. But it's okay to just have 1 or 2 bad reeds in an experiment of 10 to 15. In my case, I had 6 bad reeds in a batch of 38. So that's not a bad number, especially considering that I didn't have any repeat shapes that were bad in my opinion. There was one bad reed in 6 different shapes. So I still had 2 other reeds in those shapes to give me a good analysis of what that shape was going to do for me. So for this experiment, I kind of streamlined the processing in a way that I wanted to make sure that I was using the same environment to do each step. So for forming, it took 2 days, 2 different batches of 38 reeds. And then wrapping, I wrapped them over time. That one didn't really matter. You can do that over a span of weeks if you want. And then scraping, I did all in 2 sessions over 2 days. I tested and adjusted multiple times over about a week and a half. And then I did random testing for traits. The way I did this was I used a little piece of paper that told me all of the traits that I look for in my personal reeds and the reeds that I sell through ACDC Reeds to make sure that I was getting the traits that I wanted and assessing them based on what that individual reed did. So I kind of made myself forget the color for each shape just to make sure that I was unbiased. I just picked a reed out of a bowl of water, said, this is what this one is, and put that one away. Gave it a number, and then put it aside. I put all of my experimentation results into a spreadsheet and compared each shape to itself, and then also pulled out specific reeds that I really liked and thought that they did a great job at a certain trait to see if I could experiment with those in the future. The one thing I would like to keep doing is some aging for these reeds. I've tried these reeds probably 4 or 5 times. I haven't actually played on these like I would my normal batch of reeds in my reed case. So what I would like to do in the future is just age them a little bit, play them over time, and try and see how they pan out in the future. Get started with the actual assessment of the reed types. In this experiment, I tried to keep all of the traits that I was looking for very similar to what I look for in my own reeds. I gave smileys to reeds that I personally really liked, and I gave frowny faces to the ones that I didn't. I looked for tone quality, response, vibrancy, which high note, what's the highest note that I can get on that shape, and then I looked for the measurement from the first wire to the tip, and then also the measurement of the width of the first wire, and also the width of the tip. When I talk about vibrancy, I'm talking about which register sounds the most vibrant to me. If all three of them sound vibrant, I'll write high, medium, and low. If only the high register sticks out to me as, wow, really nice tone quality in that register, then I'm going to talk about the vibrancy in the high register. If the tone quality is going to be different for everybody on what you hear, but when I listen to these reeds, I can really feel if they sound dark, middle, or bright to me. So bright isn't necessarily a good thing to my ear. It's kind of more rattly, maybe a little bit more vibration you can actually hear. But dark sounds more smooth and is a little more muffled. So it not necessarily muffled, just more subdued. Like it still has a good tone quality. And then the response in general is going to be more about how it feels to me. So light would be good for like a beginner or a younger player or someone who just likes lighter reeds. Like they're really easy to play. They play immediately and it doesn't take much effort to play them at all. And then heavy is going to mean that it takes a lot of effort to play. Like it's not going to be an easy reed for a beginner to play, and it probably is better for a higher level to a professional musician. Depending on what you like in your reeds, either any of these could be good or bad. I don't necessarily view them as good or bad. I just view them as different. The high note is basically just describing what is the highest note that I could comfortably hit. On my personal instrument and my vocal setup, I don't get high E's very easily. I can get E flats fairly easily on every reed that I make, but E's don't come easily. So I'll go over when that happens because it's very exciting. There are 3 different types of shapes I'm going to show you in this experiment. We've got straight, and arched, I'm just going to call it arched, and goblet. This one that I just pulled out randomly is definitely straight. Like you can't see any light between the ruler and the reed itself. So that I call a straight edge. Then we have an arched edge, which actually goes inward, so it kind of like goes like this. It's very, very subtle, but it does make a difference. And then finally we have a goblet, which actually goes like this. So like it's gonna arch out and then come back in at the tip. Fox 1 had some consistent traits in tone, response, vibrancy, measurements, and a high note, the high note that I was able to get. In general, this reed was really consistent across the board in all 3 reeds that I tested. But one reed got a frowny face. Looking at the numbers, it seems like it was just too wide. The tip and the first wire were wider than the other 2 samples that I had. So perhaps I just didn't form enough of an arc when I formed the reed. I did find when I was making the reeds that it needed more tip clipping. So I ended up clipping the tip to 28, which is pretty standard. But I also wrote down that it needed aging because it starts very bright when you first scrape it. The Fox 2 shape tended to be consistent in measurements, the high note I was able to reach, the tone quality, and the response. The inconsistent trait was actually the vibrancy. I got different results for each of my reeds, so I didn't actually have a best register that this reed worked in. Sometimes it was high, sometimes it was medium, sometimes it was low, but I think the tone quality is generally consistent across the board. The reed that got the frowny face differed in tone, response, high note, and had a smaller tip width measurement than the other two reeds I tested. This could have been my error along the way. The other two reeds were not consistent in these traits specifically, so all three are represented in the results. My reed making tip for this one is that it starts really bright, so it needs a little more tip clipping to 28 to be in tune, and you should age them before playtesting and throughout the playtesting process. The Fox 3 shape got one smiley face from me, and it is consistent in tone, quality, response, high note, vibrancy, and the measurements were super consistent for this one across the board on all three reeds. There were no real inconsistent traits on this reed, which was kind of surprising. The reed that got the smiley face was consistent in vibrancy across the registers, but was oddly classified dark, while the other two were bright. Looking back on these reeds, I definitely felt that these two, trying these again today, the other two, this was the best one that I thought, and this was the one that got the smiley face. And the other two were a little bit brighter, but with some aging after a couple days, they definitely felt a little bit better, but still very bright. This shape might actually have a lot of potential because, as you can see, there's a lot of control in the lower register with dynamics, and you can get a really different tone quality and color from this reed, but I felt that the vibrancy was best in the mid to high register. It's kind of middle of the road response, so it's pretty easy to play, but it does tend to be just a little bit bright in my opinion. Of course, that could mean a bunch of things when you're testing reeds, so definitely one that I might pursue in the future. My reed making tip for this one is that it didn't actually need any extra scraping, but it definitely needed some aging because it does start out really bright. The Rieger 1A shape had some consistent traits of tone quality, which was super consistent. Response, high register, vibrancy, and measurements were all pretty consistent. There were no real inconsistent traits in this one. I felt like it had a medium response, the vibrancy was best in the mid register, but it does tend to be very bright. My general notes were that the reed that got a frowny face was generally just not a great reed. I might have overscraped, had to cut it down to 27, so it wasn't a very good representation of the reed itself. My reed making tip for this one is just make sure you age this one after scraping. It tends to be very, very bright. And if you take off too much, it's going to be even brighter and flat. So just make sure that you're not overscraping this one and make sure you age it. The Herzberg shape got 3 smiley faces. Woo woo! It was definitely one of my favorites in this experiment. And I've actually never tried Herzberg before, so I was really, really impressed with this one. It had kind of a dark, middle-ish tone quality. Definitely a medium response. It's not super hard to play, but it's not also super easy to play. It definitely takes some effort. But I felt like the vibrancy, I mentioned that it was low, medium, mid, and high register vibrancy was great. Because I just felt like it was very consistent across the registers and didn't really mute or diffuse any of the registers in any way, which is rare for a dark reed. Like usually the lower register will sound a little less bright and the higher register will sound really bright, but this one just didn't do that. I found that the measurements were super consistent. The response was also super consistent. And the vibrancy and high note were pretty consistent. The inconsistent trait was tone quality. I did feel like some of them were kind of like middle of the road and some of them were definitely dark. So I think it's just a matter of scraping a little more if you want it to get that middle vibrancy, or tone, I'm sorry. or, you know, leaving it the way it is if you want that dark quality. But I feel like it has a lot of control in all the registers to get different colors and different dynamics for sure. My reed making tip for this one is after scraping, I felt that it was generally flat, so I needed to cut the tip a bit more, but the tip ended up being at 28.5. When I cut the tip initially before I scrape, I always cut it just a little long so that I have room to cut it later if needed. Some reeds need it, some reeds don't. It just depends on the intonation of the reed. Also for this shape, I didn't get a high E when I first tested these reeds, but then I went back and tested them again today, all 3 of them, after letting them age for a couple days, and I got a high E on 2 out of the 3 reeds. And I was like, what? Why? Why now? So just, you know, keep in mind that when you go back and let them age a little bit, they might change. And this one changed in a really good way. So I was able to reach that high E on the Herzberg shape. The Van Hoesen shape I felt like was a super inconsistent shape. Given I only tested 3 reeds in this shape, but the only consistent trait I got in all 3 reeds was response, being medium. The inconsistent traits were measurements, especially the length of the reed. I had to clip these a lot to get them to be in tune. The tone quality was very different on every reed. The vibrancy was very different on every reed. And the high note was different on every reed, which is kind of weird. So generally, I'm okay with the way the shape plays, but every reed was very different in many ways. The reed I loved was actually long at 29 millimeters from the first wire to the tip. It was dark, and it had the best vibrancy in the low register. Perhaps I overscraped the other 2 reeds to cause them to need different measurements and to be too bright, but this shape would be really interesting to pursue further with my own process, because I feel like maybe I just overscraped them a little bit, and they got too bright, which made me dislike them. But I didn't necessarily dislike them, they just all were very different, which didn't really give me a good sample of what this reed shape can do. Let me know in the comments if you really liked the Van Hoesen shape before, if you like it on a specific type of cane, if you do it with a specific kind of process. I would love to hear about it, to see if we can get a better representation of this shape in general. I did get one smiley face, so definitely good there, and the other 2 reeds were decent, so I'm not against this shape in any way. It was just not my favorite, I guess. One reed making tip for this shape: no extra scraping is needed for Barton cane's profile and shape. I really felt like if I did any extra scraping, I would be over scraping the reed. The short shape had some consistent traits in measurements and vibrancy, and an inconsistent trait was tone quality. I actually felt like I couldn't really get a solid tone quality type for this reed because each reed was very different, which might be a good thing, might mean that it has more flexibility, or it might mean that I just need to experiment with this one further and see if I can get my scrape to match the reed. I really liked 2 of these reeds. I had 2 smiley faces and 1 frowny face, because the ones that I liked got great vibrancy in the high to mid register, which I'm always looking for. It's hard to find a shape that does all 3 well, and especially the high and mid at the same time. They were also able to play very high. I got a high E out multiple times, which is great. The tone quality was a little bit inconsistent, just different for each reed, but that might have been my overscraping, I'm not sure. I might pursue this shape in the future for high playing in particular, though it is a bit heavy, and I feel like after letting it age for a couple days after testing it a few times already, it just got heavier. My reed making tip for this one is that it needs a little more definition in the tip. If you look at it under a light, it doesn't really seem to have much definition in the tip from the profile and the shape in general, and it actually looks really light, which is interesting. But definitely just do more definition in the tip to get those high notes out. The Morelli shape was definitely different than anything else on my list, I think. This one, the consistent traits that I found in this one were the measurements, very super consistent. The response, the high note, the tone quality, and the vibrancy were all pretty consistent. There really weren't any inconsistent traits on this reed. All three reeds that I had played really well. But I immediately noticed once I started scraping that this shape for some reason is very hard and thick compared to every other shape that I tested in this video. I needed to scrape a lot more in every step, not only the first scrape, second scrape, third scrape, and play testing as well, to get the cane down to my preferred measurements. And I had to get them down to play comfortably. So it was a lot of cane to take off, which is fine. It was just a little bit tedious compared to everything else. After all that scraping, they were still quite heavy and pretty diffused and dark, but they have a gorgeous high register. So if you're looking for a darker, heavier reed that plays a really good high notes and also plays a really gorgeous, vibrant high register, this might be the reed for you. It might be due to the shape. Like, if you look at the shape of the Morelli reed, it's actually a lot less of an angle from the first wire to the tip compared to most other shapes that are straight. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this reed, because I hear it's very popular at Barton Cane. I did get a high E pretty easily on 2 out of 3 reeds, but in the final playtest I was unable to hit it again, and then I let it age a couple days and played all 3 of them again today, and I was able to hit the high E again. So it's definitely got a high E in there for my instrument, which is great. My reed making tip on this one is that it just needed more scraping to get the correct response level that I wanted. The Rieger 2 shape I felt had super consistent measurements, good consistent tone, and good response. The inconsistent traits on this reed were the high register note that I could hit and the vibrancy. From my experience with Rieger 2, I experimented with this when I was first learning how to make reeds. I was always told that this one was more like a low reed, and I definitely proved that with understanding the vibrancy of this one being low to mid register vibrancy. But the response, again, just like Rieger 1A, is light, and it's also very bright. Not as bright as the Fox shapes, I think, but definitely still light and bright. The reason I probably couldn't hit high notes is because it is designed to be a low reed. Definitely not for high playing, but I would keep this one for low playing, definitely. It's got a lot of control in that lower register. The reed that got a frowny face was generally just not a great reed. Just like the last one that I talked about, I may have overscraped, had to cut it down to 27, and I was not impressed with any register regarding vibrancy in that reed. It was heavy and wide at the first wire, so I think that might have made a difference in the general traits of the reed. So I discarded it from the experiment because I felt like it was a bad representation of the shape. My reed making tip for this one is that it's very bright, so it needs aging, just like Rieger 1A, but it's great in the low register after scraping. After aging, it was still bright, but it needed a shorter tip length in general. This one is different than Rieger 1A in that Rieger 1A is a straight edge, and this one is arched. Another arch shape, the Knochenhauer reeds, I felt like there were really no consistent traits per se, but the inconsistent traits were definitely measurements, vibrancy, tone, response, and the high note, so pretty much everything. But I really liked 2 out of the 3 reeds. One of them didn't really make the cut, but I really enjoyed 2 of the 3 reeds. If I scrape too much, the light bright quality can be really too buzzy on this shape. But they're good all-around reeds for vibrancy and great high register playing. I wrote in my notes that these played in tune really easily at the first play test, and that they respond very easily for different dynamics. I think it was just really easy to get these to be too light in my scrape, so try not to over scrape these because they can get really buzzy if you do that. But again, I hit a high E with very, very easily, so this was a great one for high notes, I think. I'm definitely going to try and pursue this one in the future, I think, because with my profile and my process of reed cane developing, like processing, I think it would be interesting to see how this one performs in my own process. The Jensen shape was very consistent in measurements and vibrancy. The inconsistent traits were in tone and response. I had 1 smiley face for these, which was exciting. But I didn't think that they were super good at playing in the high register. I felt like they were really stable in the low register. Obviously, they play up to high E, like D, E flat, no problem, because all reeds should be able to do that. But I didn't really feel like they were consistent enough to get up to a high E flat all of the time. This shape only had 2 specific options for cane on the Barton Cane website, which was probably a decision by the designer of the shape herself. The cane types were the softer options, Madeir or Glotan. I ended up choosing Glotan. These weren't really my preferred cane types in general. I really wanted to do this experiment only on Lavoro, but since it was a suggestion of the maker, I really wanted to stay true to what she wants for her reeds. I did find 2 reeds to be light and bright, which is what I was worried about with these 2 kinds of cane. They tend to be on the softer side. The reed I loved was the only one that I assessed as dark/middle tone quality and mid to low vibrancy and medium response, which makes me think that a harder cane might favor the shape to play higher and encourage its strengths. But I often have trouble finding vibrancy in the middle register, so this one kind of intrigued me because this one had really great vibrancy in the middle register, and might be one to pursue in the future with my own cane processing. The reed making tip I have for this one is that shading is going to look non-existent on this shape because of the softness of the cane and also just the profile combined with the shape itself. So you might not do much with a light. It's not going to look super different. But definitely don't let the shading deter you from defining the tip a little bit to get that high register to speak. Christlieb shape I found was consistent in vibrancy and the length measurement of every reed. The inconsistent traits were the width measurements, especially at the first wire, the tone quality, the response, and the high note that I was able to reach. Just now, I reached a high E, which is great, but it also feels a lot brighter than it did before. All 3 reeds kind of started off dark, and today, for some reason, they're a lot brighter. So aging will definitely change these reeds. They in general, they had more of a subdued low tone and seemed like they would be a great fit for soft, low orchestral playing, especially due to the level of possible control in softer dynamics. Though on my instrument, until today, they didn't get the brightness that I wanted, but these sound really bright to me personally. If you have any comments on the way you scrape Christlieb, or you use Christlieb, or maybe you use a different setup than I do, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this shape. My reed making tip for this one is that more scraping will open this shape up in brightness and provide opportunity for a high E. Less scraping would keep this shape more subdued, controlled, and dark in the low register, but it'll also feel heavier. I think over time with this one, if you could just keep playing it, it'll get darker generally, because right now I'm feeling a lot of brightness. But like over the next couple days, I might, if I continue playing it, it'll probably darken up just a little bit. The Stees shape I felt was really consistent in the high note that I was able to reach and the response I was able to get. Inconsistent traits were measurements in general, tone quality, and vibrancy. I just felt like I got two different things for each read. But generally the tone quality was mid to dark and the vibrancy was kind of in the mid to high register. This group of reads only had 2 instead of 3 because of my error. I remember exactly what happened to this read. I chipped a corner and it was unsalvageable and I felt very bad about it. But after scraping, these reeds for some reason flared out at the edges pretty badly. So like I actually had like a kind of like a dip and then a flare out. And so the two edges at the corners were super far away from each other. And I wasn't really sure if these would even be testable because they looked so bad. But once I soaked and play tested them a few times, it wasn't as prominent, and now you can't even tell. Like, it looks totally fine, right? Like, it looks like a perfectly good read. So I wouldn't be worried about that if that happens to you in your read making. Just keep, don't throw it away. Keep using it, keep testing it, and see if that goes away after a while. Generally, these were pretty inconsistent in all traits, though they seem to be a step up from Christlieb. Like, it seems a little bit more middle of the road, a little more consistent in vibrancy throughout the registers, and I feel like it's kind of an improvement on the goblet shape from the Christlieb original. Improvements are vibrancy in the high register and, of course, the high note I was able to get. Didn't love or hate any of these reads, but they were generally really good. Real quick, I'm going to show you all of the reeds that I got high E's on. To show you the difference between them, I'm just going to play them all in order. So first up is Knochenhauer. This is an arched shape. This is the short shape, straight shape. Morelli, straight shape. Christlieb, a goblet shape. In conclusion, I think we did a lot of great experimenting today. Thank you so much for watching and seeing my opinions. Of course, I want a disclaimer again that these are my opinions with my personal reed making style, my personal setup of an instrument, and my personal playing experience. And these shapes are all processed by Barton Kane. There are many different ways to get these shapes. So if you process them yourself, I'd love to hear your comments on what your experience with certain shapes have been. If you like something, if you really dislike something, if you've had a great experience and a bad experience with a specific shape, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Please tell me your stories. Thank you so much for all your support. I really love doing these videos for you. If you have any suggestions, if it's something you'd like to see in the future, please let me know. I'm totally open to that. And I hope that you found a shape today that you are willing to explore for your own playing. Happy bassooning!